Kevin had been married for 30 years when the divorce papers landed on his desk. 40 pages of routine legalese until page 9. A formatting glitch caught his accountant's eye, and buried in the PDF metadata was an internal paralegal note that was never meant to leave the firm. It laid out the whole scheme: coach his wife to hide a 2-year affair, fabricate a separation date before his business windfall, and inflate his assets to bleed him dry. They thought they'd buried the truth in the fine print. They handed it to the one man who reads everything. Kevin Morrow spent 40 years as a CPA, finding errors nobody else noticed. So when his wife Michelle filed for divorce, the fatal mistake wasn't his. Page 9 exposed a paralegal's hidden note: hide the affair, fabricate the separation date, drain his company. He was the last man they should have sent that document to. The betrayal began long before the paperwork. Kevin Morrow had spent a lifetime finding needles in haystacks. That was the job. For 40 years, he'd sit across from business owners and untangle their messes with the same quiet, almost irritating patience. He could spot a misplaced decimal point from across the room. He could smell an inventory discrepancy before he'd finished his morning coffee. So when his wife Michelle handed him a manila envelope across the kitchen island and said, "I think we need to separate," the first thing Kevin felt wasn't sadness. It was confusion, not about the marriage that had been drifting for years in a way that was comfortable for him and apparently suffocating for her. The confusion was about the timing. 3 months earlier, Kevin had sold his logistics software company. 2 decades of building something from nothing, and a private equity firm had finally offered him a number that made his eyes water. The sale had closed quietly. Kevin hadn't bought a boat or a new car. He'd simply transferred the proceeds into a series of conservative accounts and told Michelle they could finally retire properly: the lake house she'd always wanted, travel, their grandchildren's college funds. She had smiled at the time, but now looking back, Kevin realized the smile had never reached her eyes. She had known, she'd just been waiting for the ink to dry. The divorce papers arrived exactly 7 weeks after the funds cleared, 40 pages of dense legal boilerplate delivered by a courier to their front doorstep. Kevin sat in his home office, the same room where he'd balanced thousands of ledgers, and began to read. Page by page, there were allegations of irreconcilable differences. There was a proposed asset division that valued his company at a number that didn't exist until after the sale, a number that laid claim to wealth he'd accrued before he ever met Michelle. There were errors, a dozen small ones. A CPA's eyes don't rest, but it was page 9 that stopped him cold. A stray block of text sat awkwardly at the bottom of the page, wedged between a custody waiver for now adult children and a standard boilerplate clause about retirement accounts. It was formatted differently, a sans serif font in a document that was otherwise entirely Times New Roman. The paragraph wasn't a legal citation. It wasn't a footnote. It read like an internal email. It was an internal email. A paralegal had accidentally left a note in the metadata, and when the PDF was flattened for filing, the text had bled onto the page like a ghost. Kevin read it once, then again, then pulled his desk lamp closer. The words on page 9 outlined a strategy session. Per MTGW client, Coach M to claim separation as of March 2019. Must predate K's liquidity event. Push inflated asset schedule. M affirms no knowledge of D's whereabouts or duration of affair. D was David Harwood, Michelle's co-worker. Kevin's hands went very still. He didn't shout. He didn't call Michelle. Instead, Kevin Morrow did what Kevin Morrow had always done. He gathered evidence. He made a copy of the document with the metadata intact. He screenshotted the page. He sent an encrypted email to the one person he trusted more than anyone, a retired forensic attorney named Ellen Chow, who owed him a favor from 30 years ago. The subject line read, "I just received a gift. Call me." Michelle had spent months laying a trap. She had no idea that the trap had been laid inside a document she'd just handed to the most meticulous man she'd ever met. Ellen Chow answered on the second ring. Kevin had met her in 1993 when he was a junior accountant, and she was the most feared forensic attorney in the Pacific Northwest. She'd retired 2 years earlier to a house on Whidbey Island with a garden and a rescue Labrador, but her mind was still sharper than any blade in a courtroom. Kevin read her the paragraph on page 9. There was a long silence. Then Ellen said, "Don't say another word, bring me the file." 12 hours later, Kevin sat at her kitchen table while she scrolled through the PDF on a laptop that was air-gapped from the internet. She didn't just read the document, she dissected it. She opened the Properties tab and found the metadata Kevin had noticed but couldn't fully interpret: creation dates, author fields, revision logs. The paralegal's note had been typed into the document as an internal comment on July the 18th, 4 days before the filing. The metadata showed the comment was created by a user named Cynthia R. and was tagged with the initials of the senior partner on the case, Cynthia Ramon. Ellen looked up the firm, Harrison, Boyd and Albrecht. They specialized in high-net-worth divorce, the kind where asset division involved forensic accountants and offshore trusts and yards of legal red tape. This wasn't a small oversight. This was the kind of error that happens when someone works on a document at 2 in the morning and forgets to scrub the comments pane before hitting print. Ellen asked Kevin one question: "Do you want to negotiate or do you want to win?" Kevin looked at her. "I want them to know they made a mistake on the worst possible document." Ellen nodded. "Then we don't just forward this to your lawyer. We file a motion for sanctions and ask the court to appoint a digital forensics examiner. If this metadata is genuine, and I think it is, we're not just dealing with a bad faith filing, we're dealing with fraud on the court." That phrase, fraud on the court, is one of the most devastating things you can say in a civil proceeding. It means the legal process itself has been corrupted. It means someone tried to use the machinery of justice to commit a crime. And the evidence of that attempt was sitting on page 9 of a document that Michelle's own attorneys had submitted under penalty of perjury. Kevin gave Ellen the authorization. Within 48 hours, a forensic examiner had imaged the PDF and extracted the full comment chain. The note Kevin found wasn't the only one. There were 3 more buried deeper in the metadata, all from the same paralegal, all referencing meetings with Michelle and the lead attorney. One comment read, "M confirms no written record of D relationship. D used burner phone. Separation date will hold." Another read, "Asset schedule needs adjustment upward. Use post-sale valuation for entity not pre-sale. Firm's analyst will prepare." A third was even more damning. "Remind M not to disclose business windfall in interrogatories. Claim lack of knowledge." Kevin sat in Ellen's office as she read these aloud, and for the first time since this began, his composure cracked. Not in anger, in grief. The woman he'd spent 30 years with, the mother of his children, had not just been unfaithful, she had conspired to erase him financially. She'd coached her lover on how to avoid detection. She planned to take half of a business she had never contributed to, using a fabricated timeline designed to capture wealth that legally wasn't hers, and her attorneys had helped her do it. But here is the thing about metadata. It doesn't lie, it doesn't forget. It records every keystroke, every edit, every author, every time a document was printed or converted. In discovery, metadata is as real as a signed confession, and in the hands of a forensic attorney who knows how to use it, it's a weapon. Ellen filed a motion with the court requesting an emergency hearing. She attached the extracted metadata as Exhibit A, along with a sworn affidavit from the forensic examiner. She also requested sanctions against Harrison, Boyd, and Albrecht for discovery abuse and misrepresentation. When the motion landed on the judge's desk, the reaction was immediate. The judge, a woman named Ruth Ellerman who had been on the family court bench for 18 years, issued an order freezing all asset division until the matter could be heard. But Kevin wasn't done. While Ellen prepared for the hearing, he did what he'd always done. He dug. He called the private equity firm that had bought his company and asked for the full due diligence file. He called his former CFO and asked for all financial statements from the year before Michelle claimed their separation began. He called David Harwood's wife. That last call was the hardest. A woman named Patricia, who answered the phone with the guarded politeness of someone who suspects her marriage is already in trouble. Kevin told her what he'd found. There was a pause on the line, then a soft, terrible "I knew it." Patricia had suspected for 2 years but had no proof. Kevin offered to send her the metadata. She accepted. The night before the hearing, Kevin sat in his home office, the same room where he'd built his company from nothing, and reviewed every piece of evidence. The paralegal's note, the metadata logs, the forged separation date, the inflated asset schedule. And something new, a forensic analysis of Michelle's credit card statements, which Ellen had subpoenaed. The statements showed hotel charges in 3 different cities for dates that matched business trips David had taken. Michelle had used a joint account. She hadn't even hidden it. She had just assumed Kevin would never look. At the emergency hearing the next morning, Ellen stood before Judge Ellerman and laid out the case in 17 minutes flat. She walked through the metadata extraction. She played audio of the paralegal's comments projected onto a screen. She showed the credit card records. She called the forensic examiner to testify to the authenticity of the digital evidence. Michelle's attorney, a man named Peter Vance who had been practicing for 30 years, sat there with his mouth slightly open. He had been handed a grenade by his own office. He had no defense. He asked for a recess. The judge denied it. "Counselor," Judge Ellerman said, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 broken marriages, "your firm submitted this document. The metadata is part of the filing. I'm looking at a document that appears to contain evidence of a conspiracy to commit fraud on this court. Do you have an explanation?" Vance didn't. The paralegal, Cynthia Ramon, had apparently left the firm 2 weeks earlier. The internal review they'd conducted that morning revealed that several documents prepared for this case had been rushed and improperly redacted. But none of that mattered. The damage was done and it was lethal. The judge turned to Michelle, who was sitting at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer, her hands clenched beneath the wood. "Mrs. Morrow," the judge said, "I am going to give you one opportunity to withdraw your current filing and pursue an uncontested divorce with no claim to the disputed assets. If you choose not to do so, I will consider this a matter of fraud and refer it to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation." Michelle's face went gray. She looked at her attorney. He couldn't meet her eyes. That's when the door at the back of the courtroom opened and a man in a brown suit walked in, holding a folder. He was a process server. He'd just been to David Harwood's office with divorce papers from Patricia. In front of the entire courtroom, he handed an envelope to Michelle's attorney by mistake. Inside were photographs of David and Michelle together, time-stamped and dated. The metadata from a private investigator's camera, cross-referencing the exact timeline they'd tried to fabricate. The room went silent. Ellen looked at Kevin. Kevin didn't smile. He just nodded once slowly. The trap had sprung, and not a single person had seen it coming except the quiet old accountant in the back of the room. The process server had handed the envelope to the wrong attorney, but in that moment, it landed exactly where it needed to. Peter Vance, Michelle's lawyer, glanced down at the photographs spilling from the folder, and his face changed from professional concern to absolute horror. Judge Ellerman leaned forward from the bench. "Mr. Vance, are these photographs relevant to this proceeding?" Vance stammered. He tried to push the folder away, but Ellen was faster. She approached the bench, holding a copy of the photographs that Kevin had quietly printed that morning, the same ones Patricia Harwood had delivered to her own process server. "Your Honor, these photos by themselves are just evidence of an affair. But when you cross-reference the timestamps with the metadata from the plaintiff's own filing, you get something else entirely." Ellen projected the timestamps against the fabricated separation date. The affair began in January of 2018, not after March 2019 as Michelle's filing claimed. And the metadata from the paralegal's comment chain included a note that read, "Per M, first D-contact was November 2017. Michelle had told her own legal team the real date, and they had coached her to change it anyway. It was all there, typed and saved, and inexpertly hidden in a PDF. Judge Ellerman called a 30-minute recess, but not before instructing the clerk to seal the photographs and the metadata extraction as court exhibits. Vance immediately moved to suppress the metadata, arguing it was work product and privileged. Ellen's reply was devastating. The metadata was included in a document filed on the public docket. Privilege was waived the moment your office hit submit. You cannot unring that bell. During the recess, Michelle sat in the hallway, alone. David Harwood stood 15 feet away, facing the wall. Neither spoke. Cynthia Ramon, the former paralegal, had been contacted by the firm that morning in a panic. She admitted to rushing the final PDF conversion late at night, claiming she didn't know the comments would embed. But that defense crumbled when the forensic examiner Ellen hired discovered that the comment pane had been deliberately left open when the file was flattened. The metadata showed that the file had been printed to PDF twice, once with comments removed, and then again, minutes later, with them re-enabled. Someone had restored the comments before the final filing. The examiner couldn't say who, but the digital fingerprint pointed to a user account belonging to a junior associate who'd already left the firm under unclear circumstances. When court resumed, Judge Ellerman didn't waste time. She denied the motion to suppress. She granted Ellen's motion for sanctions against Harrison, Boyd, and Albrecht, ordering them to pay Kevin's legal fees thus far and referring the matter to the state bar for an ethics investigation. She also vacated Michelle's claim to the business windfall, ruling that the separation date was demonstrably fraudulent. But she wasn't finished. She turned to Michelle and asked directly, "Did you, under oath, sign a financial affidavit that you knew to be false?" Michelle looked at her attorney. He didn't nod or shake his head. He just closed his eyes. Michelle said, "I followed his advice. The judge didn't accept that. I'm referring you to the district attorney's office for review. This hearing is continued for 2 weeks. You remain under oath." It got worse before it got better, and for Kevin, worse meant David Harwood's world collapsing too. Patricia Harwood had not only filed for divorce, she'd hired a separate forensic accountant who discovered that David had used company credit cards to pay for hotel rooms, dinners, and flights with Michelle over 18 months. The total was just under $62,000. His employer, a mid-sized consulting firm that handled government contracts, terminated him within a week and reported the expenses as potential fraud. David was now facing not just divorce, but unemployment and possible criminal charges for misappropriation of company funds. Kevin watched this from a distance. He didn't gloat. He still loved Michelle in the complicated way people love someone after 30 years, even when they've been betrayed by them. But he felt something he hadn't felt in months: safety. The worst had been exposed, and he was still standing. The 2 weeks before the continued hearing were not quiet. Ellen received a call from Cynthia Ramon's lawyer, who was now representing her in a whistleblower complaint against the firm. Cynthia claimed she had been directed by a senior partner to keep the internal strategy notes as backup in case Michelle later disputed her own instructions. The partner, it turned out, was Peter Vance himself, the very man sitting at the plaintiff's table. Ellen deposed Cynthia, and her testimony placed Vance at the center of the document tampering. The bar complaint widened. Vance took an indefinite leave of absence. Michelle was now represented by a new attorney, a harried woman from a firm across town who had exactly 4 days to prepare a defense. The new attorney tried a different strategy. She offered a settlement. Michelle would walk away with no claim to the business, no spousal support, and a public apology. In exchange, Kevin would drop the referral to the DA. Ellen presented the offer to Kevin. He read it twice, then slid it back across the table. "No," he said, "she didn't just try to take money from me. She tried to use the court to do it. If we settle quietly, she does this again to someone else. Let the DA decide." That was the moment Kevin stopped being a victim and became something else entirely, a man who understood that silence is its own kind of permission. The final revelation came 3 days before the continued hearing. Digital Forensics Examiner, while preparing a supplemental report, discovered that the metadata on page 9 contained a second hidden layer. Embedded in the document's revision history was an earlier draft of the paralegal's note that referenced a Plan B, a backup strategy in case the separation date was challenged. Plan B involved a falsified loan document showing that Michelle had lent Kevin's business $50,000 in 2018, entitling her to repayment plus interest. The loan document existed. It had been drafted, signed by Michelle, and partially backdated using a notary stamp from an unrelated filing. The notary, when contacted, had no memory of the document. The stamp had been copied. Forging a notary stamp is a felony in that state. The DA's office upgraded their inquiry to a full investigation. Kevin learned about Plan B while sitting on his back porch, looking out at the lake. He held the phone and listened to Ellen explain the crime. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She wasn't just trying to rob me. She was building a whole second life with someone else, financed by a debt I never owed." The lake house he'd promised her, the one she'd wanted for years, sat at the edge of the water, waiting for someone to live in it honestly. He decided then that he would keep it, not out of spite, but because it was his, purchased with money he'd earned before she ever dreamed of taking it. The continued hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The DA's investigator had already interviewed Michelle twice. David was facing separate charges. Peter Vance's law license was under emergency suspension, and Cynthia Ramon had testified voluntarily, immunity on the table. The courtroom that morning was packed. Kevin walked in wearing a simple gray suit, Ellen beside him, and a folder containing every single document he'd gathered. He was not the man who received those divorce papers 2 months earlier. That man had been afraid. This man knew the full shape of what had been done to him, and he was about to watch the reckoning. The only question left was how far the judge would go and whether Michelle would ever see the inside of a cell. Judge Ellerman gavelled the continued hearing to order at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning. The courtroom was fuller than before. Word had spread. Local reporters sat in the back row. Patricia Harwood was there, not as a party but as a witness, her own divorce finalizing that same week. And Michelle Morrow, now represented by a public defender who looked like she hadn't slept in days, sat with her eyes fixed on the floor. The judge began by reading into the record the findings from the appointed digital forensics examiner. The metadata was authentic. The comments had been deliberately retained. The paralegal's notes proved a coordinated effort to misrepresent the separation date and inflate Kevin's assets. The forged notary stamp on the falsified loan document elevated the matter from civil fraud to a potential felony. The DA's investigator, seated in the gallery, had already confirmed that charges were imminent. Then Judge Ellerman addressed Michelle directly. "Mrs. Morrow, you have admitted, through your previous counsel, that you signed a financial affidavit you knew to be false. You participated in fabricating a loan document. You attempted to defraud this court and your husband of assets to which you had no legal claim. I am vacating your claim to the business windfall in its entirety. You will receive no spousal support. You will pay all of Mr. Morrow's legal fees, which as of this morning total $143,000, and I am referring your case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution on charges of perjury and fraud." Michelle did not speak. She did not cry. She simply closed her eyes and nodded once. The public defender requested a brief recess. The judge denied it. There was nothing left to negotiate. The sanctions against Harrison, Boyd, and Albrecht were equally severe. The firm was ordered to pay a $50,000 penalty for discovery abuse, referred to the state bar for a full ethics investigation, and barred from representing Michelle in any future proceedings. Peter Vance had already surrendered his license the week prior. Cynthia Ramon, under immunity, testified that Vance had personally instructed her to keep the comments embedded in case the client later recanted. That testimony triggered a broader inquiry by the Bar Association into the firm's internal practices, and that inquiry uncovered something no one expected. The metadata embedded in Michelle's divorce filing was not an isolated accident. It was part of a pattern. A forensic audit of the firm's case files revealed identical strategy comments hidden in at least 11 other high-net-worth divorce filings over the previous 4 years. The comments were placed there deliberately by senior partners, labeled as internal work product, but intentionally left in the final PDFs as a tactical weapon. If the opposing party found the comments, they might panic and settle quickly, intimidated by the appearance of detailed inside knowledge. If they didn't, the metadata could later be cited as evidence that the client had been fully informed of the risks, insulating the firm from malpractice claims. It was a legal loophole weaponized as a business model. The discovery of that pattern turned a single divorce case into a statewide scandal. The Attorney General's office opened a civil investigation into the firm's billing practices. Clients began filing malpractice suits. Cynthia Ramon, once seen as the careless paralegal who made a catastrophic mistake, was now a key witness in a much larger case. She would later testify that she had been trained to embed the comments and had never been told to remove them. She wasn't a whistleblower by intention, but she became one by consequence. Kevin found out about the larger investigation from Ellen, who called him on a Friday afternoon. He was at the lake house, installing a new dock with his son. He listened quietly and then said, "So page 9 wasn't just my miracle. It was a match that set the whole forest on fire." Ellen agreed. "You didn't just save your own retirement, Kevin. You exposed a systematic fraud inside one of the most aggressive divorce firms in the state." The final surprising detail came 3 months later, long after the hearing was a memory. David Harwood, who had already lost his wife, his job, and his reputation, was arrested on charges of embezzlement unrelated to the divorce. The forensic accountant Patricia Hyde had discovered that David hadn't just used company credit cards for the affair. He had been siphoning small amounts from client accounts for 2 years, covering his tracks with fabricated invoices. The total was just under $90,000. He pleaded guilty and received 18 months in federal prison. The affair had been the thread that unraveled an entirely separate criminal enterprise. Michelle's criminal case ended in a plea deal. She admitted to 1 count of perjury and received 3 years of probation, along with 200 hours of community service. She was also ordered to undergo a psychological evaluation and attend a financial ethics course. She never served time in a cell, but she lost everything else. The lake house she had wanted, the retirement she had planned, the man she had betrayed it for, all gone. Kevin, by contrast, kept precisely what he had built. He moved permanently into the lake house. He started a small scholarship fund for accounting students using a portion of the legal fees he'd been awarded, and he framed page 9, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The document that was meant to destroy him had instead revealed the truth, because he was the kind of man who read every line. In the end, that was the difference. The scheme was sophisticated, but it was delivered to the one person who would never miss a single word. And because of him, an entire legal machine built on hidden documents began to collapse. Here is the thing about that collapse. It did not happen because Kevin Morrow was a legal expert or a genius or a man with a thirst for revenge. It happened because he read the document. Every line, every page, every word. The system had been built on the quiet assumption that nobody ever truly reads the fine print. That assumption was the crack in the foundation of an entire firm, and for 11 other couples it had already worked. They had skimmed the boilerplate, felt the intimidation, and settled. Kevin didn't. And because he didn't, a paralegal's late-night oversight became a match that burned through a conspiracy nobody meant to leave evidence of. The lingering question is not whether Michelle got what she deserved, or whether David's separate crimes would have been found anyway. It is how many other page 9s are still sitting in filing cabinets and PDF attachments across the country, waiting for someone to look at them with clear eyes. The truth is, most documents hold more than they seem to show. Metadata does not forget. Comments do not erase themselves. The only thing that keeps them harmless is the hope that you will not look. Kevin Morrow looked. He read everything, and he kept what was his not by shouting the loudest, but by seeing what was placed right in front of him. If you have made it this far, do one thing for us. Subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is the only reason stories like this keep getting told. There are people out there right now, sitting at their desks, holding papers they have not yet read. Maybe you are one of them. Read carefully. You never know what is waiting on page 9.